Have you ever met a killer? Not me, but my mom told me that when she was a kid, her and her mom were driving on a highway when they saw two men taking a woman out of the trunk of the car and moving her to another car. The car was in the opposing direction, and this was before they had cell phones. By the time they got to the other side of the road, both cars were gone. Reported it to police, but they never heard anything. My mom can't forget about her yellow dress. Edit. That's all the details she really has. It still haunts my mom. She wishes she could have done something. But it was in northern Illinois on I-90. So they could have been from anywhere. My parents knew Fred and Rosemary West. I stayed at their house when I was a kid. I never would have thought them capable of what they did. 3 of the popular boys I went to high school with went over to a man's house to rob him and then beat him to death. All of them got 25 to life. I didn't know them too well, BC I ran in different circles. But I distinctly remember the next few weeks in school because a large population of our high school was devastated about them doing this, getting sentenced. I was friends with one of the guy's little sisters and she was so heartbroken. They had a counselor come and talk to every class repeatedly. It reminds me how friends, family of the perpetrators can, in a way, also be victims. My great uncle. He went to war in 1940 and found out he really enjoyed killing people. Spent the next 30 odd years hopping around the world as a mercenary. Mainly in Africa. Only met him at weddings and funerals. But as a small kid he'd tell some horrifically inappropriate Osua stories. There were many. But one sticks in my mind about how he caught a suspected spy on a raid. So they dragged him across the bush back to base tied by his ankles to the back of a jeep. He laughingly told me how there wasn't much left by the time they got back. Guy was a stone cold psychopath. A childhood friend of mine murdered his mother. She abused him as a kid. He killed her when he was 19. Sad all around. Might get buried. But my mom met Ted Bundy at a party growing up in Utah. Said he was super cute and charming and she might have gone home with him if she wasn't there with another guy. Insane to think about. I dated one for a few months. I ended up breaking it off because I always got a super weird vibe being alone with him. Near the end I was making all of our nights out into double dates or just bringing a friend along. So I figured it was better just to break it off. He ended up beating 2 people to death while they were in their bed, and then he moved the bodies and slept on their bloody mattress for 3 days. He was then caught and is now in prison. Back in college I met a guy who did 24 years in prison for a daylight hate crime a few months after he was allowed to live on his own again. He moved in across the alley from my friend's place and came over to talk to us on the porch one day. Out of the blue. Mid-conversation. He started talking about the time he spent in prison for killing a black man. Later his wife came outside and confirmed the story. And asked us what he said about it. I guess he was a participant in a gang of white supremacists who beat this other man to death. He expressed regret. And sounded like a person confused and lost on account of that action. But it was a shockingly barbaric thing to hear this man admit to. It was really uncomfortable. My mother's 4th husband cut a guy's head off when he was 19 with a steak knife. Somehow the cops said it was self-defense. He creeped me out. Her 3rd husband tried drowning me when I was 6 because I flooded the bathroom. She had a kid with both of them. I think your mother should stop getting married. I was on the same dorm floor as John O. Miller, who had murdered 2 people in Montana. Soon after Christmas winter break the police went in and arrested him. We had no idea why undercover cops kept following him around. He was kind of a jerk. I didn't interact with him much. Unsure of the actual crime, as we weren't given exact details. But my husband worked in a bait and tackle camping type store for a while. Guy came in. Gathered a few expensive camping supplies. 0-degree sleeping bag. Tent. Backpack. Boots. Act. He goes to ring him up. The card won't go through, so the guy just grabs his card back and ditches everything. Leaves. Few minutes later the store received a call from the FBI asking if he was still there. if they knew what vehicle he may have been driving. Do they have video recording in around the store? They did. They sent agents out that afternoon to the headquarters for copy of the tapes. We never heard anything after that. But definitely creepy. I met one of my aunt's old friends who owned a guitar store in my town. He seemed nice enough. Little did I know. He had his roommate, the owner of a prominent restaurant who had been missing for a couple weeks, tied up in their basement. He killed her about a month after I met him. My best friend that I served with in the army for 3 years murdered a guy in 2015 and got away with it for about 2 years. He shot some guy and slowly disposed of the body over a period of time. I think that's the part that messes me up the most when I think about it. Him cutting up a body and taking the time to scatter the remains. He was finally caught after forensics matched the bullet. He's in jail now, but things got worse. They found child PRN on his computer and he's also being charged with exploitation of a minor on top of the murder charges. Needless to say, it blew my mind when I found out. A guy I went to high school with murdered his wife with a hammer. I knew his little brother and he was a pretty stand-up guy. His older brother was on the weird side, but I didn't think murder your wife with a hammer weird. My mum told me a story of a run-in with a serial killer. My mum used to be a pizza delivery girl around the time she was 19-20. Dropping off pizza to people's houses. One night she took it to a man's house, who she described as just being off. The man paid for his pizza, complimented her hair and then shut the door. 2 weeks later it came out in the news that this man had abducted, uphead and murdered several young females. My ex went on to murder a future girlfriend. I was a teenager and my mom insisted that he was creepy even though he seemed so nice and treated me well. She actually forbid me to see him, which was something that only ever happened with him, so I did gently end things. Mums know things. A guy I was best friends with when we were 6-13 years old. I went on holiday with him a couple of times, is now serving 27 years for murder. The weirdest thing is he was a nice kid. Just troubled. Then got mixed up with the wrong people, etc. It completely changed my view on what constitutes evil. What he did was terrible, but he isn't an evil guy. Makes me think that lots of evil people aren't intrinsically bad. Just have terrible circumstances. However, that doesn't absolve them of what they do. I still see his mum from time to time. She's a close family friend and a lovely woman. I was living in a duplex when I was in high school. My neighbors were a real piece of work. Single mom. Had multiple boyfriends. And 5 kids. About a year after I finished high school and we moved out, I saw a news report that she had run over the father of some of her kids. Then stabbed him repeatedly. Apparently she didn't think she did a good enough job. So she went back hours later and stabbed him a bunch more. She was all sorts of crazy. Probably on various drugs. I always felt bad for her kids and tried to help them out when I could. I know someone who went to see Harold Shipman as a child for an ear infection. He was such a highly regarded member of the community. It doesn't surprise me that he was able to get away with what he was doing for so long. 1. Lifetime childhood friend killed. Also a friend. His ex when we were about 20. It was awful. 2. Teen casual friend wanted to rob his girlfriend's elderly relative's home. She was supposed to be out of town. He always scared me. 3. My former neighbor went crazy after his wife left him. He blew up their house with him. And 3 of their 4 children inside. 4. Met Dennis Smith shortly before he killed Carolyn Cullaby. He is locally suspected of at least one other young woman's disappearance. My father-in-law lived in LA during the 1960s and 70s. He drove a pretty flashy red car and would ride it around town. One day, he was sitting at a stoplight and a van of people stopped next to him. He described it as a van of crazy-looking hippies. The guy in the driver's seat started pointing to him. Then talked to the other people in the van. My Phil got a weird feeling about them. But the light turned green and he sped off down the road. He goes about his business as usual. But the stop stays in his mind. Years later, he was reading a book on Charles Manson. There was a part in the book where the Manson family stops at a stoplight next to the same car my father-in-law used to drive. Manson points at my father-in-law and tells his group to get out of the car and kill the man at the stoplight. They opened the van door on the opposite side so he wouldn't notice, and start walking around the back of the van when the light turns green and they sped off. As a young adult, around 19, I unfortunately was caught up in a sex trafficking ring that preyed upon young girls my age. Luckily, I got out alive. But most of my stripper friends went to Florida or California and were never found again. 2 of my close friends who refused to leave our Midwestern state were attacked in their home, with one of them a fatality. When I was a very small child, my parents were friends with this guy who could play guitar. They let me sit on his lap while he played the song I was named after. They later found out that he had killed a lady real estate agent by stabbing her several times while she was showing him a house. She used to go eat lunch with her kids every day at their school. The guy killed her because she was of Asian descent and he had some issues left over from Nam. He got caught because his neighbor saw him roller painting his truck a different color. My nana is 100% convinced she was followed by Peter Sutcliffe back in the late 70s, just before he was eventually caught by police in Sheffield. She lived in Doncaster, around 20 minutes away from Sheffield, so whether or not it was him, or just someone resembling him, still creeps me out to this day after hearing about what he did. I knew someone who had killed both his parents as a teenager. They abused him for years and at one point he was strong enough to overpower them using a kitchen knife. He apparently stabbed them dozens of times. He served several years in juvenile prison and reintegrated when he turned 18. I worked with Chris Watts in Colorado years ago. So yes, I knew an eventual killer. But I had no idea at the time. I went to high school with a guy I saw here and there who was convicted of murdering his ex. I saw him a day before he was arrested. I have not met a killer, but I know an attempted murderer pretty well. We went to university and partied together a lot. I moved away, but up until a year ago we still talked quite a bit over FB. To be honest, I cannot believe that the woman he tried to kill actually survived based on her injuries and the amount of time he let her lie there bleeding out. Over 12 hours. By the way, I was absolutely shocked when I read this. I had no idea at all. I also was best friends for 10 years with a man who ended up distributing Class A child PRN in the UK. Once again, we stopped talking about a year before the incident. If anyone would like a link to that one, let me know. I sure know how to choose friends. Ugh. Here is a link. www.google.com/www. CBC. Camp/1. My mother and a few of her friends from teacher training worked at the same school as Sonia Sutcliffe, the wife of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. For those unfamiliar with the case, the Ripper was perhaps to West Yorkshire what the Yarons was to California. My mother was afraid to leave her house alone during the years of the killings. Close bracket. They attended a party at the Sutcliffe's house and actually discussed the Ripper murders with the Ripper himself. I was deployed in Afghanistan in 2011 to 2012. We were the furthest base out on our supply road from Kandahar airfield, the main coalition base in the region. We processed a lot of Taliban fighters, but we were also one base over from VSA Balambay, and a regular army unit there often set up blocking positions for our raids. I met SS Gero Bales, and I talked to him for a while. He seemed out of it, more so than the rest of us, and he didn't really talk to me but at me, if that makes any sense. He seemed very off, but I didn't pry into what was on his mind. I just figured that he was having a tough time on that deployment. His unit had just arrived in country and some guys get a little squirrely when they first get in theater. A few days later he left VSA Balambay in the early morning and walked to 2 villages. Murdered 16 Afghan locals, kids, women, whole families, and turned himself in back at his camp. I dated one We only dated for about 6 months. And he had been a friend for a couple years before that. But as a boyfriend he was way too obsessive, emotional, and erratic. So I broke it off and avoided him at all costs afterwards. He ended up getting addicted to heroin a year or so after we broke up. And shot and killed 2 people, then stole their drugs. He's doing life in prison. Plot twist. The OP is a murderer and is trying to find all his potential witnesses. I think you're right, and I want OP to know I didn't call the FBI and I thought your purchases that night were perfectly reasonable. Please don't look for me. I was in a jail cell with Dustin Ray Dixon for a month. Guy from the Thanksgiving's Day murder. Had to look him up when I got out to make sure he wasn't lying, but the dude was absolutely crazy. Richard Ramirez was not even 20 feet from me one time. I did not engage. A guy I went to high school with had a party and a dude he didn't like showed up. He told the dude to leave. Dude's ride had left him, rural little town, so dude sat in a chair outside and fell asleep. The guy happens to discover him out there. In a methed out rage, he beat dude to death with a baseball bat. The guy and his buddy tried to remove teeth and fingers before leaving the body under bushes in the desert. Oh, so now I said before the town was small. So the next night I encountered the guy. He took my hand and kissed it. Then he bowed and called me queen bitch. Drugs are bad. Okay. Oh, so the following night, dude's mom and sister approached me at the bowling alley parking lot with missing flyers and asking if we'd seen dude. Oh, so once the whole story broke about the guy killing the dude and the chronology added up in my head. That the guy had just killed dude mere hours before touching my hand. Freaked me out. Too much guy in one story. I dealt with a few when I was assisting in a legal clinic. Not serial killer types, though. Just drug murders and stuff. Made me sad. More than anything. Most of these guys struck me as kinda dumb. Not a lot of opportunities. I'd have to wonder if things could have been different if they'd had access to treatment and better opportunities. Not me, but I used to do care at home for a lady in my village in Gloucestershire who was neighbours with Fred West and Rose West. I would go to her cottage, which was on the caravan park he lived in, when they met, and she would tell me how the sewerage for the park was always blocked and problematic whilst he lived there. I'm a therapist. I had a client who had already murdered someone. I had a client who went on to attempt murder and get a long prison sentence. And I've witnessed an attempted murder by stabbing, not related to my career. On a slightly unrelated note, I had a therapist tell me when I was 11 that I'm going to grow up to be a murderer. I'm a 27/F and I've never murdered anyone. John Gacy picked me up hitchhiking in the early 70s. I had no idea Jay had been picked up by a psycho until I saw him on the news a couple of years later. One of my neighbors worked with a mother of a 23-year-old woman who went missing in the mid-90s. Due to my interactions with him, I have my suspicions. Did you ever try to look up local crimes or anything? That's interesting. This isn't the same exactly. But there used to be someone who was a family member of someone that I used to know. I was in high school and he was in middle school. Whenever I was around him, I just got the creepiest vibe. Other than the vibe, he was pretty normal. I've always been into researching crimes and weird stuff, but never got that kind of vibe from anyone. A few years after I got out of high school, I heard that he was being accused of raping a boy in his neighborhood. The boy I knew was in 9th or 10th grade and the boy was in 6th grade. He got off for it and people thought him to be innocent. I knew he did it, though. Then a few years after that, maybe 5 years, I see online that he got arrested after taking his phone in to be fixed and them finding pictures of naked 12-13-year-old girl.